Welcome in, everybody, for another episode of the Strategy Gap. In today's conversation, we'll be talking about all things negotiation. And joining us for the conversation is George DeVardo. George's career spanned many roles in industries. After obtaining his bachelor's in economics and MBA in business management, he started his career selling financial products and portfolio planning. Later, he transitioned into advertising media, where he spent time managing media negotiations, sales, and pricing at companies like NFL Media and Playfly Sports. Prior to his current role, he was the head of pricing and strategy at Barstool Sports, leading go-to-market media pricing, planning, and strategy. And he's currently the vice president, head of revenue operations at Enthusiast Gaming, where he's building out the team to lead media product creation, sales and analytics, and business strategy partnerships. George, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan, Joe. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, kicking things off, as demonstrated in your intro, you spent a considerable amount of time in roles that involve many different parties, oftentimes having to come to an agreement, whether that's internal and strategy decisions, building pricing strategies, managing advertising or partner relationships. So for today's conversations, we really want to focus on that element and the importance of coming to an agreement and negotiations. Negotiations, I think, unfortunately, often is a word that has a negative connotation, right? You think the used car salesman and having a negative experience in negotiation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. So I wanted to kick things off broadly by asking you, what's your perspective on negotiations' role in strategy?
I think that you hit it right on the head that negotiations can have that negative connotation of used car salesman, things like that. I have felt like that because at the beginning of my career, you saw I was selling financial products. Really what that was is I graduated in 2009 in my MBA with the idea of going into finance. As we all know, what the landscape was like at that time, some of the only roles that were available, nothing on Wall Street or anything around there. It was, working through as a rep for either life insurance or health insurance firms. So that's what I was doing. I was selling health insurance, life insurance, all on commission, and my first experience out of college was all of these, like, I thought I was going into this great business world. And then we sit down and it goes, all right, here's your script, memorize the script. This is what you say. This is what you respond with. And it felt like a used car salesman. Now, I was good at it. I was good at regurgitating these scripts and doing it. But, this is like this 22-year-old trying to sell you life insurance or health insurance. That empathy isn't there. And I think that's what we're going to get into, is that I had no reference point. I didn't really believe in it. I'm just selling you a product. And I think that shines through. That's when you see the used car salesman. That's when you see that empathy isn't there. And I think these negotiations and even sales, like when it comes down to it, it's about trust. It's about this person that I'm talking to isn't trying to screw me in some way. And I think that the only way to get there is to connect on that empathetic level.
No, it makes sense. And I think we all dread the discussion that we have with the used car salesman. Everything's great until you get to the finance manager's office and all of a sudden $1,000 turns into $5,000 and all that good stuff. So, I mean, people don't generally want to be sold, but if you're solving a problem, they don't mind it. So it's just a question of how we're selling it. And I guess to your point, your positioning. And so the same thing you see a lot too with management consultants, not to disparage our management consultant listeners, but we're talking maybe at best 24, 25-year-olds coming out of MBA programs, and they're advising ExxonMobil on their diversification strategies. And it's a question of, well, what experience does a 26-year-old have? So I guess you mentioned, though, you were successful in the role, even though you felt a little off. So I guess what advice do you give people to pour themselves into a role, because sometimes you have no choice but to act as if? And so what strategies did you employ to really lean your shoulder into the role and figure out how to make it work for better or for worse?
It was about working on commission, 100% commission. Yeah, that's really what it was. That was the, needed to make money. That was it. And the only real way to be successful with it is to push yourself into it in that situation, which I didn't really love, which is why I decided to transition out of. And I would say that you can, fake it for only so long, and fake it as long as it's necessary. But it's important and necessary at one point to really move towards something that you're actually going to start to enjoy and love, because that's the only way to try to really start to become that empathetic with it when you're talking to someone, to to explain that empathy within these, because it's an arrangement, and especially in revenue operations, somebody needs to do something that you don't need to do, and you need to do something that somebody else doesn't need to do. And it's this working relationship. And even so, if it's not a negotiation, you're trying to figure out a certain operations process, a structure, workflow, that in itself is sort of saying, what do you need to get done? What can I provide to that? What do I need that you can provide to me? And the quickest way to get to that point where you're just exchanging it and it's becoming more efficient. Because I think like that's in the same ilk of negotiation, as well as in this revenue operations world of figuring out the best process flow. It's how do we get everybody to do what they need to do, not waste time. And so at the end of the day, nobody feels like they're slighted that they're doing more than the other person. So that's kind of where I see. I know I kind of kept going again to your simple question but I think like that's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of people think about negotiation from that sales context, but as you led into a bit there, negotiations happen everywhere, and I think it's all about the frame of reference that you come at it with. And so when you're working within a team or across teams, there needs to be some level of negotiation. But I think people maybe approach it the wrong way at times, where they're thinking negotiation is about, I need to win this situation. So in your mindset and kind of how you've leveraged negotiation throughout your career, what is that mindset that you use as you're working across teams and within a team to ultimately get what you want to accomplish, but not necessarily having it be this combative, like me versus you situation?
I think it's what Joe hit on before, that it's about solving problems. It's solutions. It's about understanding first, what do you need to get done? What do I need to get done? What do you need to get done? Because that's what it boils down to. Even in like a traditional negotiation, it's usually based around money or some type of terms. But in general, what we're talking about is we're part of this process flow. What do we all need to do? What is the top goal? How do our teams get involved in it? And where can we bring the most efficient process to it? And I think that's in that working, there's only one way to do that effectively, and that's to understand what the other people involved in the process are doing and how you can best as a group solve that solution.
Yeah, because I think you have your MBA. All three of us do, right? So I think one of the classes that was most interesting to me was the negotiations class, and the idea of BATNA, the best alternative to the negotiated agreement. Understanding what their BATNA is going into a conversation really helps. And sometimes that's seen in a negative way too. Like, well, what are you going to do? You're not going to buy this car. What are you going to do? But it's more generally, if, like, say you are selling a solution and you're saying, hey, we're going to solve X, Y, and Z problem. Their BATNA could be, well, I'll just go to the competitor, or I'll just go back to what I've been doing. And that does help you kind of really understand the positioning that you're going to go. And I use that all the time in my life. So it's BATNA. And it's just really, if we don't come to an agreement now, what is both party going to do? And most of the time it's both parties are worse for it, especially if you know for an absolute fact the solution that you're selling is the right one. So with that preamble, have you had any situations where you've been negotiating an agreement where you know that it's really going to be great for the customer that you're selling, but they are just resistant for all sorts of reasons, fighting tooth and nail? And what happens to the ones that don't agree, and how maybe have you brought some over to the promised land? How's that worked?
Absolutely. And I think that, in my industry in media, when you're selling these solutions, you're not selling like real products. You're selling an idea, you're selling content, you're selling the idea. Like traditionally, if you're not working client direct, you're working with an agency. So you're trying to convince this person at the agency to then convince their client that this is going to work for them. And, as a salesperson on, we'll call it on the gaming media side, we know that in gaming media, and this is a fact, the audience of gaming media is highly engaged. You'd be hard pressed to find a more engaged audience anywhere else in media. We know that the consumer metrics are, sometimes 2-3 times the brand trust. All of the things you want as a brand are amazing in this gaming media audience. We still, if you look at though the percentage of ad dollars that are in gaming media, it's probably like 3% of the business. And why is that? Because the majority of dollars are still living on linear, on TV, in network prime, where ratings have plummeted and people are still buying it because they're in this comfort zone. They're used to it. And so that's a struggle where you're fighting against this tide of people who are worried on the agency side to trust in gaming media because they haven't done it before. And you know it's going to work for them. You know it's going to work for their client. And you can only do all of these positive things. I've seen people negative sell. I don't think that's the way to go. I think you're already lost when you're at that point, when you're negative selling. So you're constantly bringing all of these areas to them. And, sometimes you just don't break through. Sometimes, and then you start to see them, spend on the Super Bowl when you could have taken a fraction of that and given them a higher engaged audience than what they just did in the Super Bowl when they said, we don't have enough money for gaming. Well, and sometimes it's frustrating, but some do come through. And, when, there was a client, I don't want to share specifics, but there was a client who we were able to get over the line. And it was a very basic, spend with us. It was a CPG, it was candy. And they had advertised in a very large platform. I think it was either NCAA, something like that at the time. And they advertised within a very small amount compared to what they spent in the gaming space. And they had told us that the engagement and followings and social metrics they got from ours outweighed what they got in the other space. So I think that it's case studies like that. It's keeping on pushing. I think gaming is at that place in its timeline in media where digital media was 15, 20 years ago, where you were pushing to try and get everybody to understand that, yeah, this is more addressable than linear, than TV. This is more addressable. And, TV was there before when it was just radio. And before that, it was print. So I think it's this timeline where it's our job to be specialists in our own business side, being gaming, to then, not negative sell, but understand that it's less waste here, especially now with everybody focusing on efficiency, especially in the advertising space, and just bringing all those positives. I think it's about case studies. It's the proof to say that, these are people who trusted us to do it. This is the benefit that they saw from it.
Got it. And there are certainly many listeners, I think, that can attest to situations like that. But then we have, the other side of our listeners and people in roles like yours that they're maybe not experiencing that sort of negotiation from an external standpoint, but they're having those same type of conversations within their team or across other teams. So you're in a unique perspective where you get a little bit of both of that. So how do the external negotiation type or dynamics, how do those relate to the internal ones? Are they the same? Are they different? Are there different considerations, same considerations?
I think they're different, at least in my experience. I think external negotiations are generally going to have some very key points. It's generally going to be about a business revenue, price. At least in my experience, like those have always been those external negotiations that's the key. You're trying to make a partnership, but at the same time, at the end of the day, it comes down to a very major piece, and that's price. So, you come to terms there and you try and focus on the other aspects. And I think that's where it's super important, where it's this main piece that you need to come to terms on. So that's when I think it's the most important to understand the other side of the conversation, because that's these other qualitative pieces are the ones where you can then have to sell through on either side, where it's going to work. A partnership like this is going to work. Do they have a certain, like from my experience, do they have a certain type of media that aligns with a large initiative that you already have internally? You only find that out through conversation and understanding more about the other side of it. So I think that's like the external piece. Internally, I think are almost harder, to be honest, because it's not as simple. There's personalities, you're managing different personalities, you're working with these people. It's not, if this doesn't work out, I don't have to talk to this person anymore. You are very much likely going to be in a meeting with that person in an hour. So I think that internal are almost harder because there's more of an emotional aspect to it, as much as you don't want it to influence that. You want it to work out, even you want them to feel good at the end of it, both parties, because it's going to have effects later on when you're going to eventually have to do another sort of negotiation internally with it.
It's something that we see a lot with our clients because we help them execute their strategic plans, and some of the plans that are not in the best position to be executed are way too big. And why are those plans too big? Because nobody wants to say no, because they want to avoid the conversations that you're referencing. So somebody comes to them and say, I think we should work on this initiative this year. And on the surface, it actually probably could be pretty good. But if you take a look at it, maybe a little bit further, maybe it costs too much or it's going to take too long. And, the idea of telling somebody that their idea is bad by saying no makes people avoid that conversation. And so techniques that have been studied and really deployed have really mentioning that you validating the person who brings the idea to you to say, this is by all means a good idea. But it is kind of fallen victim to bad timing in this situation. It's not going to make the cut for this planning cycle for these reasons, not because it's not a good idea. We validate you, but we are going to revisit it. And don't make that lip service. Actually have a mechanism to put good ideas on some sort of parking lot or some sort of list that is revisited, and it sends the right message. You can't get everything into the plan, because if the plan is too big, it's going to fail. So if we only have this much space, what can we put in there? We have to be very protective, and you're going to have to say no, people. Once in a while, you have to say no. And the way that you phrase the no and the way you go it, you do that a couple times, you'll start to stop fearing that and ultimately, hopefully have a shorter list of to-dos and higher outcomes. That's at least what I've seen people do. Do you have anything, any stories to riff off of that in terms of saying no and it went better than you expected, or maybe even worse than you expected?
So many, so many. I was actually going to ask the question as well to you. I'm super interested to see your experience, because it seems like it's going to be the same anywhere. But as a third party, you almost, do you have to eliminate that emotional aspect completely? Like for you, I think like as whether it's in consulting or as a third party, you're coming in from this outside view. Do you come in with a checklist and it's just, did you check these boxes? Nope. Okay, we're not doing it. It's sort of like that, obviously with a little bit more bedside manner, but more or less, I'm just curious, like that's probably the process that you all approach.
You want to take a crack at it? Because Jonathan did this, was in this life for a long time, and I'm still living that life.
Yeah, I think honestly relates actually to a conversation I had with a team member recently, where it was about, how do you make decisions when maybe you're not the expert in that field, or maybe the person that's asking you a question, they know way more about what they're doing than you actually do. And your goal in that situation is not to actually make a decision based off of the facts. It's to assess whether they're doing their homework and actually coming to the table with the right mindset, the right action plan, the right steps forward. And so when you're having a situation, in my perspective, where there's multiple different options, you're not necessarily always saying, hey, this is the best option, because you're not going to actually know all the ins and outs of all those situations. You're giving your perspective on, did we prepare our assessment on these options in the best way possible? And therefore, do we have any follow-up questions that can confirm that, and use that so that then the people on the other side can actually make the decision themselves. So you're not making the decision, you're guiding them to ask the questions that then they can make the decision on their own.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think to answer your question before about my experience on my side, I think that in these revenue operations roles, you are saying no more than you are saying yes in, things to take on, different initiatives. And I have found it's most important to, I think what Jonathan was just saying too, it's more, we come to an agreement together. It's not me saying no. And if I know in a situation that for whatever reason, either the numbers aren't going to work, the timeline's not going to work, trying not to say no at the onset, but saying, okay, how is like working with the person and going through, if it's a timeline issue, working through them, that timeline. Okay, how is this going to work in real life? And then we work on it together. Oh, but now it's gone too long. You see that, right? And so if they don't have an answer, hopefully, because again, like Jonathan was saying, I don't know on their end because I'm not the specialist there. I'm trying to get them to a point to either educate me on a way to get past it, or them come to the realization themselves, like, this isn't going to work. So let's find a different solution. So I think, like, time permitting, that's kind of how I like to approach it. It's always better to have them realize it's a no than you saying no.
And if I'm working with a client to help them build their plan, which we do quite often, I'll sit in a room with like 30 people and we're starting from scratch. And I'm not typically a subject matter expert on every vertical we work in, but I am a subject matter expert on what makes a good plan. So you're working with them, they're throwing their ideas out. Me being agnostic, I can see if an initiative isn't worded in a way that makes sense. So if I'm an outsider, I always say, write your plan in a way that if somebody from another department were to glance at what you say you're going to do, they're not going to have to like squint and like, what is this? But you also don't want it to be so opaque that you have to read 10 paragraphs to understand. So there's a sweet spot there. And so wordsmithing, and that is important. And you have 4 focus areas. Focus area 3 has 150 items. Focus area number 2 has 3. So clearly you're not prioritizing everything equally. There's like small things like that that allow you for them to come to their own conclusion. Because that's the other thing too, especially being a third party. You can't come in super heavy handed and say, yep, that plan's bad. Yep, get rid of that, because that's just going to alienate them. And nor am I in a position to say it, but there's some basic tenets of planning that you can point to say, you have way too many items. We need to cull this down. What ones you choose to get rid of is up to you. But objectively speaking, we need to get this list smaller. And so that's how I've seen it to be. This like, I am the third party, agnostic observer. Here are my viewpoints. And I think this is based on research. And then at that point, they usually take you up on your suggestions, and it's their decision, not yours. You are a guest at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you're also, I think, building trust, right? You have to get that trust there at least to a certain level that, to your point, you're not just this bet like the Bobs from Office Space. You're not just coming in there like them. Like they want to trust you. They want to know that you're there to help, not just to cut off the top. So, I mean, I get it, because I feel like that at certain times too, especially building out a revenue operations team for a company like EG that never had one. And so it was this fast paced growing where they focused on revenue. And then they realized over time, there's no structure to base the growth on. So then they pulled back and have now built out, a revenue operations team, a planning team, all of these different pieces where this growth and scaled growth can start to grow from. But that transition process, you felt like a consultant half the time coming in, even though you were working at this company, because you were saying, well, we can't really do this like this anymore. The resources have to go here. So I get it, I think, anyway.
Yeah, certainly. And, the underlying piece, I think, coming to all of this, back to Joe's point earlier, is understanding the BATNA or what's in it for the other person on the other side of the table. Sometimes it's pretty easy. Probably most of the time it's not that easy, and it's a challenge for organizations. Not necessarily that they don't think about the factor, but there's some sort of disconnect either up and down within an organization or across an organization. Not with like, what are we actually going to do? But in my experience, most of the time it's how are we going to get this done? In your experience, what techniques do you do to understand actually how things work within an organization, and not just what are you going to do within the organization? Because I think that does play a part in it.
Absolutely. You need to invest in meetings with different departments. I would say it's your schedule, and not so much where you're inundated, but I think the only way to truly understand it is to talk to the people from different departments, understand their workflow, sit in on calls to, even if they'll allow you to, just to shadow and understand like what goes on when you're not involved, just to see a process go on, almost take that consultant approach to it, to understand what's going on within this world, to then apply it to your side of the business. And I think it's really just about understanding. And the only way I found you can do it is through conversation, and continuous. You can't meet with somebody once a quarter and think you're going to understand their group. It's twice a month. It's a slog. It really is. I think like eventually you can get that to be less frequent, but especially like jumping into a business, if you're really trying to, like, you should be meeting with all these different, at least once a week, to just try and understand it. Because for me, that's the only way I think it works.
It's interesting because it brings me back to the idea of your closest friends are the ones that you are like proximity wise you're closest to. And there's our exceptions, right? We all remember freshman year living in a dorm. Like you couldn't have been tighter with the people on the 6th floor of Seton Hall, right? The best buds. But then next year you move to a different dorm, and all of a sudden, you're still friends. It's not the same idea. So the idea of having familiarity with somebody, meeting with them regularly, it just automatically is going to build trust. And it's funny, the word trust came up. I actually spent the day yesterday in New York at the Salesforce World Tour event that they do, a bunch of them. And they had an hour and a half keynote, and it was their CTO, co-founder, et cetera. They must have said the word trust about 5,000 times, because In their business, originally it was take all of your data and put it in the cloud. They had to fight that idea, right? Like, well, I'm not putting stuff in the cloud. That's where things get stolen. So now they're over that hurdle. Now it's AI. Trust us that your data is not going to go crazy because we have AI. And the idea is they're saying the word over and over again. That's only one thing. The other thing is, especially coming new to a role, I'm going to learn from you all. I'm going to do listening tours. I'm going to see what you have to say. If you do it once and never again, that's going to obviously not building anything. But to your point, weekly touch points, whatever that makes the most sense, it has to be consistent and it has to be genuine. And if you do that over time, trust will just automatically build. Some people want to take the shortcut, or they'll say, I did 2 calls with them. I've learned everything I need to learn. I'm good. It doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead to a place that you want to get to. And it's a tough road, and it looks like a lot of work. And most people, not most, I'd say a lot of people feel they're good after maybe 1 or 2 touch points, but it sounds like more the merrier.
Yeah, I mean, if you are good after 1 or 2 touch points, good for you. Then, but I doubt it. I agree with you. I doubt it. I think that too. Having an open mind helps with that. As in, if you come in, especially being new to a company, especially in a role like revenue operations, you're coming likely from another organization where you had a certain process that either worked or it didn't. So you have your opinions. I think that it's good to have a plan coming into a place, but understanding that it needs to be able to pivot. It needs to be a malleable plan as much as it's supposed to have certain, points that you want to hit. In this process, as you're learning more, you need to be able to at least pivot and edit it to make for the new things that you're learning. And I think that is one of the most, as much as it's important to understand the other pieces, that your plan being malleable is also, if it's 1 and 2, it's 1A, 1B. Like, I think those 2 key points, understanding the other departments and being able to understand that your plan needs to be able to pivot, are the 2 major things that make a revenue, an operation, any kind of operations process or structure successful.
Got it. Yeah, completely makes sense. I think we kicked off this question, the conversation, really thinking about how does it inform you about it, but kind of bringing it full circle back to the beginning. It likely has its benefits for then, when you get back into those negotiations or you have to say no. How have these weekly touch points or embracing relationship with other teams, how has that impacted then when you do have to have those tough conversations?
It's the trust, not to go back to it, but the trust is developed. You're not just, and it is difficult for me, at least. Like, we're all remote work, at least in the Northeast area for my company. So it's very important for continuous touch points, but it's also important, I think, that when you have the opportunity to meet in person, because that connection is very much still very different and you can't replace it. But it all works to the same piece, that you're trying to get to know this person, which you need to do in order to have these tough conversations for them not to completely go south immediately. You need them to understand that you're not just a face, you're a human. And at the same point, you have to understand that that's what this person is. They're not just this entity in a company. They're a human. They're a real person with other things outside of it, personality, likes, dislikes. And so, the more you know about that, I think it only makes those no's easier, because the more information that you have within that, you can address this you need to address the no's as more of a person, not just an entity. And I think that's what makes it more important, that connection.
The old adage, you buy from who you like, right? I mean, there wouldn't be suites at the Super Bowl. There wouldn't be, big expensive budgets for steaks for some people if that wasn't the case. So that makes a heck of a lot of sense. But as you can imagine, we could talk about this topic for days, but
it's moving away. It used to be that.
It used to be that, yeah. It's a little bit less so these days, right? Yeah. But as we're thinking about this topic, we have to unfortunately draw to a close, but we do ask a question of every guest we have, the same question to get their perspective, which would be, if you can transport yourself back into when you started your career in RevOps and strategy, what advice would you give yourself?
Run. No.
Run rate. There you go. No.
I think that understand that it's not going to be one thing, that you're going to have to understand that revenue operations is not, like, when I went into revenue operations, I really thought it was this one team where it was very, very standard. We were just going to be running analytics and, looking at different lines of the business. Understand the fact that you really need to understand those other sides of the business. You need to experience those other sides of the business to be successful in the revenue operations piece, because you are that linchpin to everything. And the only way to be like really successful and actually do it is to understand those pieces inherently and not be afraid to do it. I think at the beginning when I got into it, that's where I was looking at this and it became this monster of, wow, I didn't know all of these different pieces really run through this department. I didn't know that I needed to understand as much about sales as I do about accounting, as I do about finance. And they're so different in their own. So I think understanding that was probably it.
Great. Yeah, that's a perfect cap on the conversation. George, we enjoyed our time with you today and certainly learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did as well, and look forward to future conversations sometime soon.
Same. This was a pleasure. Thank you both.